The moment I stepped across that threshold, every part of me knew I shouldn't have come, but it was my son's birthday, and when he asked if Grandpa could be there, I couldn't bring myself to say no. So there we were, standing on the faded beige carpet of a living room that used to hold echoes of my childhood, but now just reeked of stale memories, old secrets, and the overpowering scent of cheap cologne. The furniture hadn't changed, same stiff plaid couch, same dusty coffee table with the chipped corner, but the people had. Or maybe they hadn't. Maybe I was finally seeing them as they truly were, stripped of illusions and time-worn hopes. Liam was oblivious to it all. He was bouncing with joy, his paper crown askew on his head cheeks, still smeared with frosting from the cupcake he'd eaten in the car. 7 years old, and still shining with belief in goodness, in justice, in the magic of family. He clutched the thank you cards he'd made all by himself, each one scribbled in his crooked handwriting, each one with a little heart doodled in the corner. One for everyone, he'd said proudly that morning. God, I envied that hope, that innocence. He didn't remember the years of shouting behind closed doors, the cold silence that stretched like a chasm between my father and me, the night Frank Carter looked me dead in the eyes after I left my husband and said I had tarnished the Carter name. But I remembered. I remembered all of it. And still, I smiled for Liam. Always for Liam. Liam, I called, keeping my voice upbeat. He turned, lit up, and shouted Grandpa before darting across the room with arms wide like nothing had ever happened. Like Frank hadn't spent years pretending I didn't exist. Like he hadn't once told me with a voice like gravel, you were always the family's mistake. Frank didn't smile, not even a twitch of the lip. He just gave Liam a short nod and handed him a box small, carelessly wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Not even the decency of real wrapping paper, just the comic strip section folded awkwardly around it. I should have stopped him right then. I felt it, this prickling sense of dread crawling up my spine. I opened my mouth to intervene, but then I saw Tiffany, my sister, watching me from across the room, with her arms folded, one hip cocked like she was posing for a fashion magazine. Glass of red wine already in hand at 2 p.m. Her smug little smirk froze me in place, transported me back to being 7 years old, trying to decode what I'd done wrong this time. Liam plopped down on the floor in the middle of the room, legs crisscrossed like it was story time, and began tearing into the newspaper with a grin that could have melted a glacier. For a heartbeat, I let myself believe I was being paranoid. That maybe, just maybe, this was Frank's awkward attempt at humor. But then Liam stopped. His little fingers reached into the box and pulled out something black, dusty, and jagged coal. Real coal. Dirty chunks that left dark smudges on his skin. The kind of thing you find at the bottom of a grill, not in a birthday gift. The room went silent. A stillness so loud it buzzed in my ears. Frank's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. No emotion, no inflection, just flat and cruel. Naughty kids get what they deserve, he said. Something in me broke. A crack in my chest like a lightning strike. Liam's small hands trembled, but he didn't cry. He didn't throw the box or scream. He just looked up at me, those big, hazel eyes swimming with tears he hadn't let fall, and whispered, "Did I do something bad, Mommy?" It was like the air had turned to cement. I couldn't speak. Couldn't even breathe. My throat closed up and I stood there frozen. Then Tiffany laughed. A sharp snort, loud and mean, like she couldn't even pretend to hide her pleasure. Just like his mother, she said, swirling her wine. Useless. That was it. My hands curled into fists, heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. I stood ready to grab Liam and leave, to never look back. Party or no party, I was done. But then Frank, calm, as if he hadn't just humiliated a child, held up his hand. "It's okay," he said, his voice as dry as sandpaper. "I got you a gift, too." I turned slowly. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but instead I watched as he held out a plain white envelope. "There's something inside I think you should see," he said. "Found it in your mother's attic. Figured it was time. I didn't want it. Didn't want a damn thing from him." But there was something in his expression, something hollow, almost smug, that made me reach for the envelope anyway. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside was a photo, just one. Old, curled at the edges, the colors faded with time. But the moment I looked at it, the entire room seemed to gasp, sucked into silence. People who know me now probably think I'm just a quiet single mom, someone who smiles too much, who works too hard, and talks too little. And they wouldn't be wrong, but they don't know where I came from. They don't know why I left. They don't know the weight I carried. After my divorce, I had nowhere to go, so I came back here. Back to the house that never really felt like mine. My mom, Margaret, though everyone called her Maggie, had passed the year before. The place sat still in empty dust on every surface and silence in every hallway. It was all I could afford. I told myself it was temporary, just until I got back on my feet. But that house didn't feel like shelter. It felt like quicksand. Not just because of the memories, but because of the ghosts that still lived in the walls. My mother had been the only softness in that house. She could quiet a storm with just a look. Frank, on the other hand, was the storm. Retired Navy, zero tolerance, zero warmth. I don't remember the last time he hugged me. Maybe he never did. He'd always wanted sons. He got me instead. And then 3 years later, Tiffany came along. She became everything he wanted, obedient, polished, loud, when she needed to be, but always in the right ways. She played the game. I didn't. I got pregnant too young. Married a man I never should have. Stayed in that mistake far too long, and when I finally escaped, I did so with bruises you couldn't see and a toddler on my hip. When I showed up at my parents' doorstep 3 years ago with Liam in one arm and a duffel bag in the other, Frank barely glanced at us, just muttered, "You made your bed like we were stray animals." I remember wondering if he even saw Liam or if in his eyes I was still just a blemish on the Carter family photo. Tiffany swung by the next day with a bottle of wine and that fake sympathy smile she wore like designer perfume. She looked at Liam like he was a stray puppy. "He's got his father's eyes," she said, almost pitying. That was the first time I wanted to slap her. It wasn't the last. I stayed in that house just long enough to scrape together a new life. Found a job baking pastries in the early mornings, worked night shifts at a gas station on weekends, got Liam into daycare, and saved every penny I could. And when I finally had enough, I packed our things and moved to a tiny apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Still, despite everything, despite the echoes of old wounds and the unspoken truths buried deep within the walls of that house, I wanted Liam to understand what family was supposed to mean. Or at the very least, I wanted him to believe in the idea of it. That somewhere beyond the cracks and cruelty, there could be warmth and belonging. So against my better judgment, I let him see Frank now and then. Brief, carefully watched visits where I controlled the time and the space, making sure no shadows crept in. And to Liam's credit, bless his innocent little heart, he adored his grandfather. Children are like that. They don't see the jagged edges. They don't notice the fractured lines that run beneath the surface. They just see the moment you smile, the gesture of a shared candy, the way someone pats their head and says their name. They believe those moments are truth. So when Liam turned to me a week before his birthday and asked in a voice tinged with nothing but hope, "Mommy, can Grandpa come to my party?" I hesitated. I had told myself I was done with that house, done with performing for people who only ever watched me to count my flaws. But Liam's eyes had that look, the same one he had the first time he asked if he could bring a worm he found on the sidewalk into the house. Hopeful, gentle, earnest. And somewhere buried in the parts of me that hadn't yet turned cold, I found a fragile thread of belief. Maybe Frank had softened. Maybe the time apart had shifted something. So I said yes. I even agreed to have the party there, his house, the old battlefield. I called it neutral ground in my head, a sort of emotional ceasefire. Maybe if I showed up with my head high, my son beside me, I could rewrite the story. Maybe they would see that I had changed, that I wasn't the scared, bruised girl who had run from this house clutching a crying baby and a bag packed in the dark. I bought Liam a Lego set he'd been dreaming about for months, some kind of dinosaur fortress with lights and trapdoors, and wrapped it in bright yellow paper dotted with cartoon balloons. He didn't care about the toy as much as the cards, though. He sat at the kitchen table for hours the night before, tongue poking out the corner of his mouth as he carefully wrote his name on each one in those big crooked letters only first graders can get away with. "I want them to know I love them," he told me, beaming with pride, holding up a card decorated with a giant red heart. That single sentence nearly undid me. Because deep down I wanted that too. I wanted a moment where love was enough to transcend all the damage. But I didn't realize how badly I had misjudged the battlefield, not until the box of coal hit the floor. The morning of the party arrived with a gnawing in my stomach that felt like hunger, but wasn't. It was nerves or maybe dread, some anxious undercurrent I couldn't shake, even as I iced cupcakes in the still dark kitchen. It was barely 6 a.m., and I was already smoothing vanilla swirls onto chocolate bases like they could make everything better. As if enough frosting could mask what we were walking into. I knew better. But I kept going. Liam woke early, bouncing into the kitchen in his paper crown arms flailing like a superhero mid-flight. "It's my birthday," he shouted loud enough to make the neighbor's dog bark. For a moment, I let myself exist in that joy, watched him twirl in circles, oblivious to the history we were about to walk back into. He didn't know the weight of what it meant for me to return to that house. He didn't know that Frank hadn't so much as sent a card during the collapse of my marriage, or that Tiffany had dismissed my truth as drama when I finally had the courage to name what my ex had done. To Liam, Grandpa was just the man who gave him strawberry hard candies and let him press all the buttons on the recliner, and I didn't have the heart to take that away from him. Not yet. We arrived late on purpose. I'd planned it that way. The less time I gave them to find something wrong with me before the cake was even cut, the better. The house hadn't changed, it was too pristine, too quiet, like it was trying to cover something up. Frank answered the door in slacks and a crisp white button-up, like he was hosting a business luncheon instead of his grandson's birthday. His expression was stiff, his eyes unreadable. "You're late," he said flatly before turning and walking away. Tiffany, of course, was already inside, holding court in the living room in a designer blouse that practically screamed, "Still doing better than you." Her smirk was cocked and loaded before I even stepped past the threshold. "Amy," she purred, her voice thick with venom disguised as civility. "Brave of you to show up." I ignored her. Not today. I wouldn't let her ruin Liam's joy. The guests were a mix of a few aging neighbors, and Tiffany's friends, well-dressed strangers who didn't know Liam's favorite color, or that he still called lightning skycrack. But Liam didn't care. He glowed like the candles on his unlit cake, handing out his homemade thank you cards with reverence beaming at every adult who bent down to receive one. I perched on the edge of the couch, my purse clutched tight in my lap, mentally counting down the minutes until we could leave. Then came the gifts. Liam settled in the center of the room, surrounded by glossy bags and boxes. He opened a few, an action figure, a space book, a strange electronic globe that Tiffany had probably ordered online without a second thought. And then Frank stepped forward. He cleared his throat and held out a small box square and wrapped in newspaper. "This one's from me," he said. I froze. Liam looked up at him, eyes alight with gratitude. "Thank you, Grandpa," he chirped and began unwrapping it eagerly. The paper came off in flurries and then he paused. His fingers reached inside and pulled out a chunk of something black, dusty, and jagged. Coal. His smile faltered. He turned the lump over in his hand, dust smearing his palms. "What is it?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Frank didn't flinch. His voice was as cold as marble. "Naughty kids get what they deserve." Every scar I'd ever hidden beneath layers of survival suddenly flared open, raw and burning. Liam blinked rapidly, confusion creeping into his voice. But I was good. My heart shattered loud and sudden in my chest. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for the explosion, the fallout. Like this was a stage, and we were the show. Tiffany snorted, delighted. "Just like his mother," she said. "Useless." I stood so fast my chair scraped the floor, fury rising like a wildfire. I wanted to scream, to throw the coal back at them, to gather Liam and run. But before I could move, Frank spoke again like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just humiliated a child. "It's okay," he said. "I got you a gift too." The room held its breath. I stared at the envelope in his hand, plain white, unassuming, held out like some kind of peace offering or trap. I didn't know whether to take it or knock it to the floor. Liam stood beside me, quiet, his breath shallow and quick, like he was trying not to cry. And in that moment, something inside me twisted with grief and rage, not just for me, but for him. Because he was learning far too early that love can be weaponized. That people who are supposed to protect you can be the ones who hurt you the most. I reached out and took the envelope. Not because I trusted Frank, but because I had to know what game he was playing, what truth he was hiding, what piece of me he was trying to claim or destroy next. I needed to see it. I needed to face it. Because whatever was inside that envelope, I knew one thing for sure. Inside the envelope, cradled between trembling fingers, was a photograph aged its corners, curling its colors faded into a palette of soft sepias and pale grays. As I drew it out, I could feel the heat of their eyes on me, the room holding its collective breath. But the moment my gaze fell upon the image, the world dissolved into a quiet haze, muffled and distant as if I had slipped beneath the surface of a still, deep lake. It was a hospital photo, one of those old Polaroids that captured a single heartbeat in time and sealed it in grainy permanence. My mother, younger than I had ever seen her, hair pulled back, eyes tender with exhaustion and joy, rested against a mound of pillows swaddling a newborn. Me. But the man beside her was not Frank Carter. He was someone else. His features were soft where Frank's had always been sharp, his eyes full of light instead of ice, and his smile God. His smile radiated warmth. One hand was wrapped protectively around my mother's, the other lightly touching the baby's blanket, and in that touch, in that moment, frozen in time, was something I had never seen in my childhood home. Love. On the back, scrawled in my mother's delicate, flowing script, were the words, Amy, born from love. Always remember that. My hands shook. My voice, when it finally emerged, was a whisper. What is this? Frank stood with his arms crossed, his face an unbreakable wall. Your mother had her secrets, he said. Figured it was time you saw one. My heart slammed against my ribs like it wanted to break free. Are you saying? He's not you. My question hung between us like smoke. He didn't reply. He didn't have to. The silence was its own confession. Tiffany let out a nervous laugh, a brittle sound that cracked in the still air. Is this some kind of joke? Frank turned his gaze on me, cold and unwavering. You were never mine. The breath caught in my throat, a gasp that never fully formed. In that instant, the entire puzzle of my life clicked into place. The cold indifference, the constant disapproval, the sense that I had been merely tolerated, never cherished. I had never belonged. Not to him. You knew all these years, I managed to say. His jaw clenched. Your mother told me the truth the day she died. She wanted me to forgive you. I told her there was nothing to forgive. You were never mine to begin with. But the photo wasn't what stunned me. It wasn't the man I didn't recognize or the message she left behind. It was the sudden, searing understanding that Frank Carter didn't hate me for failing. He hated me for existing. In that moment, something deep inside me unraveled. Every ache for his approval, every buried plea for love, every silent hope that maybe one day he would see me, they all turned to ash. And in that ash I found something I didn't expect: clarity. I looked down at Liam, who sat silently on the floor, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his little face hidden in a tangle of confusion and fear. I knelt beside him, took his soot-darkened hands gently into mine, and said softly, but with conviction, You didn't do anything wrong. You hear me? You are not what they say. You are good. You are so, so good. His lower lip trembled. Then why did he give me coal? I swallowed hard. Because he's wrong, I whispered, and we're done letting wrong people tell us who we are. Then I stood, my knees shaking, but my voice steady. I met Frank's eyes, those eyes I had once feared, once sought to please, and I said, I may not be your daughter by blood, but I was a child in your house. And in that house you chose cruelty over and over again. That ends today. I lifted Liam into my arms, felt the weight of him settle against me like a shield, and turned toward the door. Our coats hung just a few feet away, our escape so close I could taste the fresh air outside. But just as my hand found the doorknob, I paused, not out of doubt, not out of hesitation, but because something inside me demanded one last truth. I turned. Frank hadn't moved. Tiffany sat rigid on the couch's armrest, her lips parted, as if trying to find a response that wouldn't come. I raised the photo. My hand didn't tremble. Do you know the difference between you and the man in this picture? I asked. No answer. He didn't need to control. He didn't need to be feared. He just loved. In one single frame, he gave more to my mother and me than you did in decades. Still silence, so I pressed on. I used to lie awake at night wondering what I did wrong, why I was never enough, why I could never crack the wall you built around yourself. And now I know I wasn't broken. You were. And instead of healing you, let that pain rot into cruelty. I looked at Liam, his eyes wide and watching. He was learning more than I wanted him to in that moment. But maybe he was learning what strength looked like, too. You gave my son Cole on his birthday, I said, my voice low but sharp. You called it discipline. I call it emotional abuse, and I'm done excusing it. With slow, deliberate care, I placed the photograph on the table, away from his reach, but not out of sight. Tiffany finally found her voice. This is ridiculous. You don't even know who that man is. He could be anyone. I don't care if he vanished the day I was born, I replied. That photo proves he loved me. And in one captured moment, he showed more humanity than this house has seen in 30 years. Then I turned to her. And you laughed when your nephew was hurt, like it was entertainment, like he was a joke. You may dress it up with wine and designer shoes, Tiffany, but you're just another branch on a dying tree. Her mouth fell open. For once, she had nothing to say. You want to know what useless looks like. Try going your whole life without compassion. Try passing down silence like it's wisdom. I may have fallen, I may have failed, but I never stopped feeling. And that more than anything is why I will never be like you. With that, I opened the door. Cold air hit us crisp and sharp, and it felt like the first breath of a new life. As we stepped out into the sunlight, something lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't just the escape. It was the weight of generations gone. I wasn't less, I wasn't broken, and neither was Liam. We were free. 6 months later, that photo still hangs on a shelf above Liam's bed. It's framed now, nothing ornate, just warm wood, no glass as if to invite the memory to breathe. It sits beside his nightlight and a scruffy stuffed elephant he refuses to sleep without. He asked me once, is that my other grandpa? I told him the truth. I don't know his name, sweetheart, but I know this: he loved me, and that love helped me love you better. Liam nodded and said with the casual wisdom of a child, then I love him too. And somehow that was more than enough. After we left my father's house that day, I didn't cry. I didn't scream or unravel into pieces like I might have once done. Instead, I sat silently in the front seat of the car, both hands gently clasped around Liam's smaller one, grounding myself in the present, as the weight of the past slowly peeled away. He sat beside me, his legs swinging just above the floor mat, cheerfully devouring the cupcake I had stashed in the glove box, a tiny blue frosted consolation prize for a party that had never really happened. Best birthday ever, he mumbled through a mouthful of sugar and food coloring his smile, glowing with an innocence so pure it nearly brought me to my knees. There was something fiercely beautiful about the way children adapt the way they bend, but rarely break their spirits unburdened by the weight of expectation and history. But I didn't want resilience to be something my son had to perfect. I didn't want survival to be the legacy I handed him. So I made a decision. Clean, quiet, absolute. I cut the cord. No more calls, no texts laden with guilt and obligation. No more birthdays circled on the calendar out of habit or pressure. I shut the door to that house, and with it to that chapter of my life. And here's the strangest part. Once I stopped trying to contort myself into someone worthy of their approval, I started seeing who I really was. I started therapy, real therapy. Not the kind where you nod through polite advice and leave with a hollow feeling, but the messy kind, the gut-wrenching kind, the kind that makes you dig into the dirt of your own memories with your bare hands. I confronted the way Frank's silence had etched itself into my sense of self-worth like frostbite. I examined how Tiffany's sneers echoed the voice inside me that whispered, I wasn't enough. I peeled back the layers of every relationship I'd held onto too tightly too long, hoping it would someday return what I gave. And somewhere in all that grief and the excavation of decades of shame, I discovered a truth I hadn't dared believe before. I was never broken. I was simply raised in a house that taught me to mistake control for care, cruelty, for structure, shame, for discipline. And the most powerful thing I ever did was stop the cycle. I chose Liam. I chose me. I chose a future that didn't carry the same bruises as my past. And Liam flourished. He began drawing pictures of superheroes who wore glasses and capes, who looked suspiciously like me. He told his kindergarten teacher I was the bravest girl in the world. And for the first time since I'd fled my marriage, I allowed myself to believe it might be true. One night as I tucked him beneath his dinosaur blanket, he looked up with those wide, thoughtful eyes and asked Mommy, Are you happy now? I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I hadn't expected him to ask it. And because somehow the fact that he cared meant more than I could express. I'm getting there, I said. And I meant it. We don't have the kinds of birthdays with bounce houses or grandparents who send crisp bills and cards. But we do have Sunday morning pancakes with too much syrup homemade blanket forts that collapse in laughter and bedtime stories whispered under covers while the night hums around us. We have music in our kitchen flour on our noses and jokes that only make sense to the two of us. We have love, honest, unrushed, and finally safe. As for the photograph, it remains in its modest wooden frame, perched on the shelf above Liam's bed. No glass, just polished pine, warm to the touch and glowing softly in the light of his night lamp. It sits between a well-worn book of bedtime stories and a frayed gray elephant he refuses to sleep without. And if you're reading this, if you're someone like me, someone who's spent a lifetime carrying pain that was handed down, like silverware polished and passed along, know this: you are not your father's cruelty. You are not your sister's ridicule. You are not the judgment they muttered when they thought you couldn't hear. You are allowed to outgrow your origin story. You are allowed to rise from the ashes of what hurt you and build something that feeds your soul. Sometimes the greatest gifts in life don't come wrapped in paper. Sometimes they come in the form of clarity, in the form of healing, in the form of a photograph that tells a truth your whole life tried to deny. If this story touched you, made you pause, made you feel like someone finally gets it, give it a thumbs up. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, real ones, the raw and unflinching kind, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications. We're building something honest here. And you, your story matters.